Okay, thank you, Ollie. In a bit of safe time, if any of you in the room have a question, can you speak to Ollie afterwards? Thank you. Next up, he probably needs very little introduction, but this is Jonathan Shanklin, who is the BCR for Cambridgeshire and also the Chair of the England Committee and the Honourable Fields Meeting Secretary. He's also an Emeritus Fellow here at the British Antarctic Survey. He's worked here since 1977 and is notable for his early work on discovering the ozone hole, for which he won a Polar Medal. Anyway, I'll pass over to Jonathan, who's going to give us a local perspective.
Right, so I'm definitely focusing on Cambridgeshire rather than with my hat of Chair of England for this talk. And as you've seen in some of the other presentations, Cambridge is something of a hotspot for recording effort, if nothing else. And I think there's quite a lot else that goes on here. Ollie's also shown us the overall trends in England. And what I wanted to do to start with was focus on some of the drivers for the trend. And I've come across a bit of sort of brainstorming, a list of things that have driven some of those trends that we've seen. And perhaps the bottom line is we're pretty greedy. We want to have our cake and eat it. And it's entirely our fault for most of these things. So I'm going to give a few examples. We must remember that it's not only plants that are declining, much of our biodiversity is declining as well, across the board. In addition to the biodiversity problems, there are many other environmental crises. There's soil degradation, plastics, water, air, you name it, and pretty much it's all in a crisis. And WWF have shown that we're using resources at a rate that requires more than one planet ultimately. And clearly that cannot continue for ever so long. Some of this comes down to economics. We've got our economic pyramid that must keep growing. But of course, to increase the height of the pyramid a little bit, you need to increase the base of it a lot. And that means that it needs more and more resources for those at the top to benefit. And so the bottom line is really that there's just too many people to be supported in the way that everybody would like. And I fear that it will take nature to deal with this, perhaps with the impact of a giant meteorite, as happened 65 million years ago, and certainly hastened the end of the dinosaurs. But I'm now going to look at a few of the plants that are involved in some of those trends. So one are the invasive species that introduce lots of competition. And here I've shown a picture of a few of these. And particularly notable was that while the overall England decline for the Pydium draba hoary-cress is downwards, locally there's a substantial increase. And so I think, as already suggested, the hectare level trends may be obscuring things that are going on at a finer scale, which is not really possible to map because of the difference in recording effort. Another highly invasive species is the Irish ivy, which often forms a moving tide advancing over more fragile plants. And in the background, there is also, in this picture, the Himalayan giant blackberry, the Rubus armeniacus, which again is becoming more and more widespread and forms dense thickets, outcompeting many of our native blackberries. Plants don't just stay in gardens. This is a Cambridgeshire County Wildlife Site, which has acquired some Arum italicum. And here the England trend very much mirrors our local trend, where there's been a huge increase post-2000. Some of the natives are increasing as well, and Carex pendula is something of a thug in many native settings. In part, this may be because gardeners have encouraged it by planting it as an ornamental and then discovering that really they didn't want it as an ornamental because it's taking over their garden. And because of the nature of its leaves, not many of our herbivores touch it. But a colleague at the Wildlife Trust says that guinea pigs really love it. So perhaps we need more wild guinea pigs to combat it. Increased footfall is a big problem for many of our smaller sites, particularly. And dog walking has helped to increase this. And the dog walking creates trampled paths through woodlands where the fragile woodland vegetation becomes exterminated. Dogs do what dogs do, and that adds to the fertilization of the ground. And they really like jumping in streams and muddying it around because their owners don't control them properly. So all of those are driving a decrease in much of our wildflowers. Neglect is another issue. This is a local chalk stream which has become far too overgrown and shaded, and so many of the species that used to grow there no longer do. And some of the old railway lines are becoming similarly choked with vegetation, although volunteers often make good strides in improving things. Technology plays a part too, because a modern tractor can plough a steep hillside or an old meadow that's too wet for previous tractors to plough, and that can damage things in a very short space of time. Tree planting is really popular, but I think that of this more as a displacement activity. We're actually doing something about climate change. Planting the trees really is not going to have much of an effect in this country, but perhaps we need to concentrate on reforesting the Amazon as a bigger priority. There's a culture of tidiness, and this is another of our city wildlife sites that a new cycle path has been put through. The banks there produced a really wonderful crop of various arable weeds that have provided food source for insects and then birds, but for the tidy-minded contractors, it all had to be trimmed. Light pollution is something I put down, and the view on the left there shows you what might be seen of Orion, which is visible in the evening at the moment, from an urban location, and on the right is what you might see in a countryside place. Why does this matter? Well, lots of moths fly at night, and many of those will be pollinators. Moth species in general are in decline. If the pollinators are in decline, the seeds will be in decline, and our flowers will be in decline. And I've just thrown this in as a potential issue. Has the cover of mosses increased, obscuring what would have been bare patches that seeds could fall into and grow and germinate? We've seen some of the local floras. There's a few of them on display today. And so what I'm going to do now is really go straight in to look at some of our local species. And using heat maps showing where plants on our rare plant register are most frequent does highlight some of the best areas. So for Cambridgeshire, the Ouse and Neen washes are real hotspots. Also the sands around Gamlingay and the Bretland sands in the east. The area around Cambridge really stands out because we do so much recording there. So looking at some of our flowers, the pasque flower is supposed to be the county plant of Cambridgeshire, and it's vulnerable at both county and England level. And this is mostly loss of habitat on the chalk. But where they do occur, and we had one case recently at a local wildlife site where it had never been seen before but popped up, and it was picked and had gone overnight. So there are further issues of educating the public to make sure that they don't pick things when there's only one of them. One of our local specialities is Linum perenne, perennial flax, and we've got a really good site for it at the Magog Down Golf Course, which is a SSSI site, and it's doing really well there and spreading. So given the right habitat, some of these plants do really well. But our arable plants are doing nothing like as well. And this is one that I find a really attractive little plant. It's in decline at all levels in the county. And as the graph from the atlas shows, it's declining in England. Another one that is not so widespread in our county, Spogoarbensis corn spuri, again declining widely. We've only got a couple of places left where it's still reasonably likely that you'd spot it, and everywhere else it's mostly just occurring as a casual. Another of our local specialities is the yellow vetchling. This one I think possibly has a fairly long life in the seed bank. So again, if the habitat can be disturbed a bit to allow it a chance to come up, and then not mown when it's in flower, there is a chance that there could be some return for this species. So again, it's about providing habitat that's critical. The slender tear is perhaps in its heartland here in Cambridge, but nevertheless, it's still in decline generally. And so again, this is an issue of habitat. Some things, though, are increasing, and Oenanthe cricata, those in the west of England would think, what on earth, why is this on your rare plant register or anything like that? But even here in the east, it does seem to be on the increase. So it was only a couple of sites for it, and now it's slowly increasing. What's driving this one? I have absolutely no idea. But I don't think it's got any wetter here in the east. It certainly hasn't been in response to climate change either. So but there are certainly questions to be answered behind some of the trends. Again, one of our really quite nice rare plants that grows in the ooze washes, and I was delighted to see how well it was doing in one particular field. I think this is because it hadn't been cattle grazed, and that made a huge difference in how it was able to flower, and hopefully it will have set seed. Another one that's substantially in decline across England, but interestingly here at the survey it's doing really well. So we introduced it into our East Meadow a number of years ago as a plug plant, but when we mow the meadow, I should say it's not actually we, it's mostly me that mows the meadow by hand using a scythe, and I get some volunteers to rake off the cuttings. I don't cut the devil's bit scabious until it's had a chance to set seed, and it clearly, when it's allowed to set seed, it does really well. So I suspect this is a change in management practice as well as just habitat loss that's causing a decline. There are some quite odd species that can be threatened at the local level. Again, those in the west would be surprised to have Cercium palustri in their rare plant register. But here we're on the edge of that gaping hole in its distribution in Fenland. And for that reason, it's perhaps more fragile here than it is in a wider area. Another one that is also partly affected by that Fenland gap is brooklime. And again, because it's not so common in some parts of Cambridgeshire, it's on the margins of being in and out of the rare plant register. I think I'm going to have to just change my criteria for when I take something out and put it back again in order to account for these things that are on the margins. So what for the future? There are some signs of promise, I think. We're now looking more at biodiversity net gain in planning decisions, and this will become more and more compulsory at council levels. The new development must have a net gain in part of it. There are plans for local nature recovery networks where we can try and improve existing habitat or devote new habitat to nature. There is the promise from government of 30% of land for nature by 2030. We have the knowledge from the work done for the Atlas that we know what is fragile, we know what needs to be protected, and that is going to influence decisions in the future. And one of the things that will come out of this are going to be new red lists across England. Some plants, however, are always going to remain very rare on the local level. And so for us in Cambridgeshire, we've got one site for frog orchid. And I would be very pleased if we suddenly came up with a few new ones, but I suspect that that is unlikely. Some of this habitat creation may encourage some species to come back from the seed bank. And this was a really nice example on one of our local sites where they created a new scrape in an old chalk pit, and lo and behold, purple milk vetch appeared on the floor of the scrape. So elsewhere in the county, it has to be tended with loving care almost to keep it going. Here at this site, they decided, yep, we like it now. Again, locally, there are some attempts to try and improve biodiversity on some of our poorer sites. And one idea is to try turf stripping and see what comes up on the remains. So I'm told that nothing has been sown in these bare patches, and it will just be left to see what comes up. And who knows, we might see something of interest. And then there are going to be more and more plants, I think, that expand their range from the south northwards. And already we're seeing a strong trend in lizard orchid in Cambridgeshire, with lots of new sites suddenly appearing, including a couple within the city itself. So it really is quite amazing how some plants are responding. So we've got the evidence from the Atlas, and now that evidence needs to be used, which I hope is going to give a nice lead in to our next speaker, but I will hand over to our chair for anything else.